Dawn broke cold over the Montana mountains, painting the peaks in shades of amber and rose that would have stopped a younger man in his tracks. Jack Malone didn't stop. At 68 years old, he'd learned that beauty was something you appreciated while moving forward, never while standing still. His boots hammered the dirt trail in a rhythm older than memory, each footfall a declaration that age was just another obstacle to overcome through discipline and stubborn will. 5 miles. Same route every morning for the past 3 years since he'd moved to Silver Creek. Up through the pine forest where the air tasted like resin in winter, across the ridge where eagles hunted, then down the switchbacks to his property. The run wasn't about fitness anymore, though his lean frame carried almost no fat despite nearly 7 decades of wear. It was about proving something to himself each sunrise, that Jack Malone was still a Marine, still capable, still dangerous if the world demanded it. Sweat soaked through his gray t-shirt despite the October chill. The fabric clung to scars that mapped a violent history across his torso, a puckered bullet wound below his left shoulder from a Viet Cong ambush in '69, the long surgical scar down his sternum from the heart surgery 5 years back, a dozen smaller marks from knives and shrapnel, and the general chaos of a life spent in harm's way. He ran shirtless sometimes, letting the mountain air kiss those reminders of mortality. But today felt different. Today carried a weight he couldn't name. The trees thinned as he approached his cabin, a modest structure he'd built mostly himself from local timber. American flag snapping in the breeze above the porch. Gun shop attached to the main building, Malone's Armory and Range painted in simple black letters above the door. Behind the property, a shooting range stretched 200 yards, backstop carved into the hillside with sandbags and old tires. This was his kingdom now, smaller than the streets of New York he'd patrolled for 30 years, quieter than the jungles of Vietnam, but his all the same. He slowed to a walk for the final 100 yards, hands on hips, breathing hard but controlled. Pain is just weakness leaving the body, his drill instructor had screamed at Paris Island in 1965, and Jack had taken that gospel into every mile since. His knees ached with the particular fire of cartilage worn thin by time and trauma. His lower back sent warning signals that another decade might bring a cane into the picture. But today, this morning, Jack Malone could still run 5 miles before most people finished their first cup of coffee. Inside the cabin, he moved through his morning ritual with military precision. Shower hot, then cold, the temperature shock keeping his cardiovascular system honest. Shave with a straight river at the bathroom mirror, same careful strokes his father had taught him 60 years ago. The face staring back carried every year, deep lines bracketing his mouth, crow's feet at the corners of steel gray eyes, the weathered complexion of a man who'd spent too much time in harsh climates. His hair, what remained of it, had gone white as Montana snow. But the eyes hadn't softened. They still carried the alertness of a predator, the eternal vigilance of someone who'd seen how fast the world could turn violent. The photo on the dresser caught him as it did every morning. Sarah, his wife, frozen at 43 in that picture, 10 years before the cancer took her. She was laughing at something outside the frame, that full-body joy she'd radiated even when life threw its worst. They'd had 28 years together, far less than Jack had promised at the altar, but more than a lot of men in his line of work ever got. 5 years since her funeral, and he still expected to hear her voice from the kitchen, still reach for her side of the bed in those confused moments between sleep and waking. He pulled on jeans and a flannel shirt, both worn soft with age. The shoulder holster came next, a 1911 .45 caliber pistol settling into place with familiar weight. The same model he'd carried in Vietnam, updated but essentially unchanged. 7 rounds of hardball ammunition, single action trigger, enough stopping power to end most arguments permanently. He wasn't expecting trouble at his gun shop on a Tuesday morning, but Jack Malone had learned decades ago that trouble rarely announced itself in advance. The kitchen smelled like the coffee he'd set on a timer the night before. Dark roast strong enough to strip paint. He poured a cup into a mug that read, "NYPD Homicide, We Work for God," and stood at the window overlooking his property. The shooting range lay empty in the morning light. Beyond it, Silver Creek stretched out in the valley, population 4,200, the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbor's business, sometimes before the neighbors did themselves. He'd moved here after Sarah died, needing distance from New York's concrete canyons and the memories haunting every corner. Silver Creek offered something he'd never really experienced: peace, or at least the possibility of it. 3 years of selling ammunition and teaching gun safety, of knowing every face that walked through his door, of nights so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. It wasn't the life he'd imagined at 20, full of righteousness and violence, and the certainty that he was making the world better one arrest at a time. But it was honest work, and at 68, honesty was worth more than glory. The phone rang as he finished his coffee. Walt Brennan's name lit up the screen. Jack smiled before he even answered. Walt was the closest thing he had to family in Montana. A fellow Marine who'd served in the same godforsaken jungle 40 years ago, though they'd never crossed paths until both ended up in Silver Creek by accident, or fate, or whatever force moves old warriors toward each other in their final chapters. The voice on the other end carried worry beneath its usual gruffness. Jack, you got time this morning? Need to talk, not on the phone. 20 minutes, your place. The line went dead. Walt wasn't one for long goodbyes or unnecessary words. That was part of why they'd become friends. Two men who understood that silence was often more honest than speech, that the bond between Marines needed no constant reinforcement through chatter and sentiment. They met for coffee twice a week, played cards on Friday nights, attended the same VA meetings they both found simultaneously helpful and infuriating. Walt owned a tavern in town, a place called Walt's Tavern, with all the imaginative naming of a man who valued function over flair, and it had become the unofficial headquarters for the local veteran community. Jack locked the cabin and walked the half-mile into town, preferring the movement to driving his truck. Silver Creek woke slowly around him. Mrs. Patterson opening her grocery store, old Frank Delacroix sweeping the sidewalk outside his barbershop, teenagers stumbling toward the high school with the universal misery of youth forced into early rising. They all waved or nodded as Jack passed. He'd earned their respect not through deliberate effort, but through consistency. Always fair in his business dealings, quick to help a neighbor in need, the kind of quiet competence that small towns recognized and valued. Walt's Tavern occupied a corner lot on Main Street, a two-story building that had started life as a hotel in the 1890s and evolved through various incarnations before Walt bought it 15 years ago. The bottom floor served drinks and food, the top was Walt's apartment, and the basement hosted the Veterans Support Group meetings twice a month. It wasn't fancy: scarred wooden bar, mismatched tables, a jukebox that only played country and classic rock. But it had soul. The walls carried photographs of local service members going back to World War II, a visual timeline of sacrifice that made the place feel less like a bar and more like a shrine. Walt was already inside, wiping down tables with methodical strokes, even though the place wouldn't open for hours. At 72, he moved like a man 10 years younger, though the tremor in his left hand betrayed the degenerative condition his doctor called essential tremor and Walt called a pain in my ass. He'd been a rifleman in the same general area of Vietnam where Jack had operated, both of them swimming through that jungle hell at different times, never knowing they'd end up comparing notes in a Montana town decades later. He looked up as Jack entered, and the worry Jack had heard on the phone was visible now in the tight lines around his mouth. They didn't bother with greetings. Walt poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured toward a booth in the back corner where conversations stayed private. Got a problem, Jack? A big one. Jack sipped his coffee and waited. Walt wasn't dramatic by nature, so whatever had him spooked was genuine. The Iron Skulls. You heard of them? Jack had. Hard not to, if you paid attention to the news trickling out of nearby counties. A motorcycle club that styled itself as a brotherhood but operated more like organized crime. Protection rackets, drug distribution, the occasional violent enforcement that kept people scared and compliant. They'd been expanding their territory over the past few years, absorbing smaller gangs, turning legitimate businesses into front operations. The kind of operation Jack had spent his NYPD career dismantling, except here there was no dedicated task force, no federal resources, just overworked sheriffs in underfunded counties. They've been running protection schemes in Millbrook and Harrison. 23 businesses paying monthly, from what I hear. Nobody testifies because they're smart about it. Never directly threaten, just imply what might happen if the money doesn't flow. Sheriff can't move without evidence, and evidence requires witnesses willing to talk. Walt's hands shook slightly as he gripped his coffee cup. Jack recognized the signs of a man working up to bad news. They came by yesterday, two of them, asked about my monthly insurance payment, said this is a dangerous world. Lots of things can go wrong with a business, fires, vandalism, accidents. Said they could make sure none of that happened for $5,000 a month. Jack felt something cold settle in his gut. $5,000 monthly would bleed Walt dry within a year. The tavern did decent business, but nothing extravagant, and Walt lived lean anyway, most of his profits going back into maintaining the building or supporting veteran causes. You pay them? Walt met his eyes. Told them to get the hell out of my bar. Said I was a Marine and Marines don't negotiate with criminals. Jack almost smiled at that, almost. But the situation wasn't funny. The Iron Skulls had a reputation for making examples of people who refused their offers. A garage in Millbrook had burned to the foundation 2 days after the owner turned them down. The owner himself had been hospitalized with broken ribs and a punctured lung, injuries officially attributed to a fall down his own stairs despite everyone knowing the truth. They coming back? Friday, 8 p.m., said that's collection night, and they'll be expecting my first payment. Walt's jaw tightened. Jack, I didn't serve in Vietnam and build this place over 15 years just to hand it over to some thugs playing dress-up on motorcycles. But I'm 72 years old with a bad ticker. Can't exactly go toe-to-toe with 20 bikers. How many actually show up? Walt considered. From what I've heard, the leader brings maybe 8 or 10 for collections. Rest of the club stays at their compound outside Harrison. They do it like a show, roll up with loud engines, make everyone nervous, collect their money, leave. Psychological warfare. Jack knew the playbook. He'd seen it in gang territories across New York. The same pattern of intimidation that worked because good people didn't want trouble and were willing to pay for the illusion of safety. The Iron Skulls were banking on that same formula in rural Montana, where law enforcement was stretched thin and communities were isolated enough that screaming for help meant screaming into a void. I'll be here Friday, Jack said simply. Walt shook his head. You're not a cop anymore. This isn't your fight. I'm a Marine. That doesn't retire. The words hung between them, a statement of identity more than defiance. Jack had turned in his NYPD shield at 63 after 3 decades of service, but the deeper programming remained. Protect the innocent, stand between chaos and order, face down bullies regardless of the personal cost. Those imperatives didn't come with an expiration date. You could get killed, Walt said quietly. These aren't street punks. Leaders ex-military, ex-ranger if the rumors are true. Knows tactics, knows violence. And he's got at least 40 men in his crew, most of them ex-cons or military washouts looking for belonging somewhere. Then it's a fair fight, Jack replied. I've faced worse odds in rice paddies with better men shooting at me. Walt studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. A weight seemed to lift from his shoulders, though they both knew this was just the beginning. All right, but we do it smart, not heroes, just survivors. They spent the next hour going over the layout of the tavern, discussing sight lines and defensive positions with the same clinical detachment they might have used planning a barbecue. Jack noted the exits, the places that offered cover, the spots where an ambush would be most effective. His mind slipped into that tactical mode so easily, it frightened him sometimes. This ability to view a space in terms of kill zones and fields of fire, even after decades away from active combat. When Jack finally left, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the October chill. He walked back toward his property, mind churning through scenarios. The smart move would be to call the sheriff, let law enforcement handle it, but Jack knew how that would play out. Sheriff would need evidence of a crime, evidence required witnesses, and witnesses were already too scared to come forward. By the time the legal system mobilized, Walt would be bankrupt or dead. The gun shop opened at 10, and Jack spent the morning in the familiar rhythm of small business. A rancher buying ammunition for varmint control, a young mother taking her first concealed carry course, nervous but determined after a close call in a parking lot 2 counties over. An older gentleman browsing the used rifle selection with the careful attention of someone on a fixed income. Jack moved through these interactions with patient professionalism, offering advice without condescension, making sure everyone who left his shop was safer and more knowledgeable than when they'd entered. Around noon, a teenager pushed through the door with the particular energy of youth, trying to appear older and tougher than reality allowed. Jack recognized him. Tommy Rodriguez, 17, son of a ranch hand, good kid from what Jack had observed. But today, Tommy's eyes carried worry that aged him prematurely. "Mr. Malone," Tommy started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. Jack waited, giving him space. He'd learned that silence often encouraged honesty more effectively than questions. "My dad sent me. He wants to learn to protect our home." Tommy's voice cracked slightly on the last word. There's been trouble." Jack led him to the counter, leaned against it in a posture that was relaxed but attentive. "What kind of trouble?" Tommy glanced at the door as if checking for eavesdroppers. "The bikers. They've been coming around asking questions about who owns what, how business is going. Dad says they're sizing everyone up for a shakedown. He's scared. Won't say it, but I can tell." The cold feeling in Jack's gut intensified. If the Iron Skulls were already doing reconnaissance in Silver Creek, the timeline was tighter than he'd thought. They weren't just hitting isolated businesses anymore. They were planning a full territorial expansion, turning this quiet town into another revenue stream in their growing criminal empire. "Your dad's smart to be careful," Jack said, choosing his words precisely. "Tell him to come by when he has time. I'll walk him through home defense basics, no charge. And Tommy, if those bikers approach you directly, you be polite, but don't give them information. Answer their questions with questions. Make yourself forgettable." Tommy nodded, relief visible in his posture. "Thank you, sir. Really." After he left, Jack stood alone in his shop, surrounded by tools of violence that could protect or destroy, depending on who wielded them and why. He'd spent his entire adult life in service to the idea that good men with guns could stand against bad men with worse intentions. That philosophy had carried him through Vietnam, through 30 years of detective work in one of the world's most dangerous cities, through the daily grind of trying to impose order on chaos. But doubt crept in sometimes, especially in the quiet moments. What if he'd been wrong? What if violence only begat more violence? And his entire life had been spent feeding a cycle that could never be broken? Then he thought about Tommy Rodriguez, barely more than a child, asking him for help protecting his family from predators. And Jack knew that doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. The world had wolves in it, and sheep needed sheepdogs, and sometimes the sheepdog was a 68-year-old man whose best years were behind him, but whose teeth were still sharp enough to make the wolves think twice. The afternoon brought more customers, but between transactions, Jack's mind worked the problem. He needed intelligence, numbers, weapons, routines, vulnerabilities. Fighting blind was a good way to DIY, and while Jack had made peace with mortality, he preferred it not arrive during a bar fight in Montana. He needed allies too, though he was reluctant to pull others into danger. This wasn't their war, except it was. That was the insidious thing about communities. Once you became part of them, their problems became yours. Their fears, your responsibility. Jack had spent 3 years establishing roots in Silver Creek, and now those roots bound him to its fate. Around 4 p.m., Sheriff Tom Diaz pushed through the door. Jack knew him by reputation and limited interaction. Former Marine, 12 years in law enforcement, generally competent if constrained by the usual limitations of rural policing. He was 55, solidly built, with the particular wariness that came from trying to maintain order with insufficient resources and too much territory to cover. They exchanged nods. Tom browsed the ammunition selection with the focus of a man who knew exactly what he needed but wasn't in a hurry. Jack waited. Finally, Tom approached the counter with a box of 9mm rounds. "Heard Walt Brennan had some visitors yesterday. Word travels fast. Small town. Plus, I make it my business to know when the Iron Skulls are expanding their territory." Tom's voice carried frustration. "And before you ask, my hands are tied. I can't arrest them for asking questions or making veiled suggestions. I need evidence of actual crimes and witnesses willing to testify. What if you had both?" Tom studied him. "Walt told you he refused their offer," Jack nodded. And I'm guessing you were planning to be at the tavern Friday night when they come back. Seems like a good night for a drink." A long silence stretched between them. Tom's jaw worked as he processed the implications. "Jack, I've got 3 deputies covering 400 square miles. State police are 2 hours away on a good day. If this turns into a shootout, people die, and I'm the one answering for it afterward." "Nobody's looking for a shootout," Jack replied carefully. "Just making sure Walt doesn't get pressured into paying for protection he doesn't need." Tom leaned closer, dropping his voice. "Off the record? I wouldn't cry if someone reminded these assholes what real soldiers look like. The Iron Skulls have been terrorizing this county for 3 years, and every legal avenue I try hits a wall. But on the record, I'm telling you to let law enforcement handle it." Jack rang up the ammunition. "On the record, I'm just a citizen exercising my right to be in a public establishment." Tom paid and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Victor Kane, that's the leader, ex-Army Ranger, dishonorably discharged for assaulting a superior officer. Smart, trained, mean. His right hand is Marcus Delacroix, ex-Green Beret turned mercenary. These aren't amateurs playing tough." "Neither am I," Jack said quietly. Tom nodded slowly. "I know. That's what worries me. Be careful, Jack. Montana's got enough ghosts already." After the sheriff left, Jack locked up the shop and walked back to his cabin. The sun hung low over the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. He made dinner: grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, brown rice, the disciplined diet that kept his body functional despite its age. While he ate, he pulled out his laptop and did what any good detective would do: research. Victor Kane's name yielded limited results, most of them from military databases Jack still had access to through veteran networks. Dishonorable discharge in 2008 after a pattern of violent behavior that culminated in hospitalizing a captain who'd questioned his methods. Before that, decorated Ranger with multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Skilled in tactics, weapons, and the kind of asymmetric warfare that Jack himself had studied. A dangerous man made more dangerous by intelligence and training. Marcus Delacroix had an even darker history. Green Beret who'd gone private contractor after his military career, worked for various security companies in Africa, in the Middle East, doing work that stayed carefully undefined in official records. The kind of soldier who'd learned that violence could be a commodity, that skills honed protecting democracy could be sold to the highest bidder, regardless of ideology. He'd returned to the States 5 years ago and promptly vanished from any official records, surfacing now as Victor's second-in-command. Jack sat back and processed the information. He'd faced skilled opponents before: Viet Cong sappers who could slip through perimeter defenses like ghosts, gang leaders in New York who'd built criminal empires through ruthlessness and tactical acumen. But this was different. He was 68 years old, slower than he'd been, more brittle in the places that mattered. Victor and Marcus were in their prime, surrounded by 40 men who might be thugs but were still capable of violence in numbers. The smart money said, walk away, let the law handle it, however slowly. Don't risk what remained of his life for a town he'd only called home for 3 years. But Jack Malone had never been particularly smart in the self-preservation sense. He'd volunteered for Vietnam when he could have stayed stateside. He'd joined NYPD homicide when easier assignments were available. He'd charged into burning buildings and faced down armed suspects when retreat was tactically sound. Sarah used to say he had a hero complex, that he needed to save people because he couldn't save himself from his own demons. She might have been right, but knowing your flaws didn't necessarily change them. He pulled a locked case from under his bed and opened it with a key he kept on his personal keychain. Inside lay tools of violence he'd hoped to never need again: tactical vest, extra magazines for his 1911, a combat knife from his Marine Corps days, night vision goggles that were technically restricted, but that certain connections could still procure. He didn't remove anything, just stared at them, remembering when these items had been as familiar as his own hands. The photo on his dresser caught his eye again. Sarah smiling, frozen in that moment of joy. What would she think of this? Would she understand that some battles chose you rather than the other way around? Or would she be disappointed that even at 68, even after everything, Jack Malone still couldn't walk away from a fight. He closed the case and locked it again. Tomorrow he'd decide about the gear. Tonight he just needed to think. Sleep came hard, as it often did. His mind wouldn't shut down, kept running scenarios and calculating odds, and seeing all the ways Friday night could go catastrophically wrong. When he finally drifted off, the dreams came as they always did: jungle trails and incoming fire, and the faces of men he'd killed when he was barely old enough to vote. Vietnam never left you. It just learned to wait patiently in the shadows of your mind, ready to resurface whenever stress or fear lowered your defenses. He woke at 3 a.m. from a nightmare about a village burning, Charlie Company taking fire from all sides, and a young Jack Malone trying desperately to save a wounded Marine while the world exploded around them. His heart hammered, sweat soaking the sheets. He lay there breathing hard, counting backwards from 100 until the adrenaline subsided and he could think clearly again. The cabin felt too quiet, too empty. Sarah's absence was a physical ache on nights like this. She'd known how to talk him down from the bad dreams, knew when to hold him and when to give him space, knew the difference between the man she'd married and the ghost of the Marine he'd been. 5 years since cancer had taken her, and Jack still reached for her in these moments of vulnerability. He got up and made coffee, knowing sleep was finished for the night. The mountains outside his window were invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, just shapes against the sky, slowly lightening toward another day. Wednesday morning, 2.5 days until Friday night. 2.5 days to prepare for a confrontation he didn't want but couldn't avoid. The run that morning was harder, his body protesting the interrupted sleep and the stress hormones still coursing through his system. But he pushed through because that's what Marines did. They pushed through pain and doubt and fear until the mission was accomplished, or they were dead. There wasn't a third option. By the time he opened the shop, he'd made his decision. He would stand with Walt on Friday. He would face down the iron skulls with whatever it took. And if that meant violence, then so be it. He'd spent his whole life trying to be a good man, but goodness sometimes required hard choices and harder actions. The morning brought a surprise in the form of a woman he'd seen around town but never officially met. She was in her mid-30s, lean and athletic, with the kind of watchful eyes that marked either law enforcement or military. She moved through his shop with practiced efficiency, examining weapons with obvious familiarity, and Jack recognized a kindred spirit. When she finally approached the counter, she met his gaze directly. "Maya Reeves, I tend bar at Walt's Tavern. Heard you're planning to be there Friday night." Word really did travel fast. Jack nodded slowly. "Walt's a friend. Friends show up." She studied him for a moment, some calculation happening behind those alert eyes. "I'm ex-Army, Special Forces, 3 tours in Afghanistan. I know trouble when I smell it, and what's coming Friday smells like a Category 5 shitstorm." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You planning to be there too?" "I work there. Kind of hard to avoid it." Maya's tone was dry. "But I'm also tired of running from fights. Did enough of that when I came home." There was a story in that last sentence, layers of pain and guilt that Jack recognized because he carried similar weight. Combat veterans all had their scars, visible and otherwise. The visible ones healed. The invisible ones just learned to hide better. "How long you been in Silver Creek?" 6 months. Came looking for quiet after everything. Thought bartending would be boring enough to let me decompress." She shrugged. "Turns out nowhere's quiet anymore." Jack made a decision in that moment, trusting his gut the way he had for decades. "Maya, if you're there Friday, you stay behind the bar. This isn't your fight." Her expression hardened. "With respect, Mr. Malone, I'm capable of deciding which fights are mine. I've got more combat experience than half the Iron Skulls combined. If they start something, I'm finishing it." The certainty in her voice carried echoes of his own younger self. That absolute conviction that skill and courage could overcome any odds. He wanted to warn her that confidence got people killed, that being capable wasn't the same as being prepared for the specific chaos of bar fights turned warfare. But he also remembered how he'd reacted to similar warnings at her age, had ignored them, pushed forward anyway, survived through luck and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. Fair enough. Just remember that surviving combat doesn't mean you're invincible. These people aren't Taliban or Iraqi insurgents. They're Americans who know the same terrain, speak the same language, understand how to exploit our systems from the inside. Maya nodded, some of the hardness leaving her expression. I know. I've seen what happens when you underestimate domestic threats. But I've also seen what happens when good people do nothing, and I'm done being a bystander. They talked for another 20 minutes, establishing a mutual respect built on shared experience, if not shared history. Maya had skills that could be useful: close quarters, combat training, tactical assessment, the kind of situational awareness that kept you alive in war zones. But Jack also sensed vulnerability beneath her competence, the barely healed wounds of someone who'd seen too much and was still processing the cost. After she left, Jack felt both reassured and more worried. Reassured because having a trained soldier on their side improved the odds significantly. Worried because Maya clearly carried trauma that might complicate her decision-making under stress. Combat veterans with PTSD could be unpredictable when violence started, old programming taking over in ways that sometimes helped and sometimes created more chaos. The afternoon brought Walt to the shop, looking older than his 72 years. He moved to the counter with careful steps, and Jack saw the tremor in his hands had worsened. "Doctor says it's stress," Walt reported without preamble. "Says I need to reduce anxiety, maybe take early retirement, stop worrying about things I can't control." He laughed bitterly. Easy advice from someone who's never had 40 bikers threaten his livelihood. Jack poured them both coffee from the pot he kept brewing in the shop's back room. They sat in silence for a while, comfortable with each other's company in a way that only came from shared history. Walt had saved Jack's life once, indirectly, had been the one to spot the signs of Jack drowning in depression after Sarah's death, had called him twice a day until Jack finally answered, had physically driven to New York to drag him out of his apartment and convince him that life continued even after loss carved holes in your soul. "I've been thinking," Walt said finally. "Maybe I should just pay them. 5,000 a month hurts, but it won't kill me immediately, and it keeps everyone safe." Jack set down his coffee carefully. "You know that's not how this works. You pay once, they own you forever. Next month it's 6,000, then 7, and they'll add new conditions. Use your basement for storage. Let them conduct business in your bar. Turn a blind eye to whatever criminal activity they're running. Before you know it, your tavern is a front operation and you're complicit in everything they do." Walt nodded slowly, not arguing because he knew Jack was right. "I'm scared," he admitted quietly. "Not of dying, I'm 72, made peace with mortality years ago, but of failing this town. The tavern's been the heart of the veteran community for 15 years. If it goes under or gets corrupted, where do those guys go? Who takes care of them? Then we make sure it doesn't go under," Jack replied with more confidence than he felt. "Friday night, we stand together. Show these bastards that Silver Creek isn't as easy a target as they think. What if people get hurt?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Jack had asked himself the same thing countless times since agreeing to this confrontation. What if his stubbornness, his refusal to let criminals win, resulted in innocent casualties? Could he live with that weight added to everything else he already carried? "People are already hurt," Jack said carefully. "They're hurt by fear, by paying protection money, by watching their community get carved up by predators. Sometimes you have to risk harm to prevent greater harm. It's an ugly calculation, but it's the only one that makes sense in situations like this." Walt stared into his coffee. "You ever think about what we were like before Vietnam? I barely remember that version of myself. Some kid from Nebraska who thought war was noble and death was distant, encouragement charging forward regardless of consequences. Then I spent 2 years in that jungle, and when I came home, I couldn't recognize the person in the mirror." Jack understood completely. Vietnam had broken something fundamental in everyone who'd gone, not just physically but philosophically. They'd been sent to fight for democracy and freedom and discovered that war was mostly chaos and fear and trying not to die while killing people who were trying to kill you. The noble causes got lost somewhere in the mud and blood, replaced by the simple, desperate arithmetic of survival. "We're different than we were," Jack agreed, "but that doesn't mean we're worse. We learned hard lessons that most people never have to learn. We know what real evil looks like, what it's capable of, And we know that standing against it requires sacrifice. The kid from Nebraska might not have been able to face what's coming Friday, but the Marine who survived Vietnam, he's exactly who we need. Walt managed a weak smile. When'd you get so inspirational? 30 years of talking suspects into surrendering instead of shooting. You learned to sound convincing. They sat together until closing time, not talking much, just being present for each other in the way old soldiers could. When Walt finally left, Jack locked up and walked back toward his cabin, but instead of going inside, he detoured to the shooting range. The targets hung at various distances, 25 yards, 50, 75, 100. Jack pulled his 1911 from its holster and loaded a magazine with practiced ease. The weight felt good in his hand, familiar in a way that transcended conscious thought. He'd carried this weapon or variations of it for 50 years, and it had become an extension of his will. He fired slowly at first, reacquainting himself with the recoil and sight picture. Then he increased the pace, moving through magazines with the muscle memory of 10,000 hours of training. The shooting was meditation for him, a way to quiet his mind and focus purely on the fundamentals: sight alignment, breath control, trigger squeeze. Everything else fell away until it was just him and the target and the moment of releasing potential violence. When he'd emptied 6 magazines, he walked down range to check his groups. Tight clusters at center mass, even the 100-yard shots clustering within a 6-inch circle. His hands were steady, his eyes still sharp enough with reading glasses, his body still capable of delivering accurate fire under controlled conditions. But Friday wouldn't be controlled. Friday would be chaos and adrenaline and split-second decisions made in bad lighting with innocent people nearby. No amount of range practice fully prepared you for that kind of stress. He packed up his gear and finally returned to the cabin. Dinner was simple: sandwich and soup, the bare minimum needed to fuel his body. He wasn't particularly hungry, but discipline meant eating regardless of appetite. Sarah had always worried about his tendency to skip meals when stressed, had made him promise to take care of himself even after she was gone. He'd kept that promise mostly. The evening stretched long. He tried reading, gave up after realizing he'd reread the same page 5 times without absorbing anything. Tried watching television, couldn't focus. Finally, he pulled out a yellow legal pad and started making lists. Things that could go wrong, contingencies for each scenario, resources he'd need, people he should notify. The planning helped. It gave his anxiety something productive to focus on, channeled his nervous energy into preparation rather than worry. By 10 p.m., he had 3 pages of notes and a splitting headache. He took 2 aspirin, then 3, knowing he wouldn't sleep regardless. The laptop beckoned. He pulled up Victor Kane's limited social media presence, studying the few public photos. Kane looked exactly like you'd expect. Heavily muscled, covered in tattoos, the kind of aggressive masculinity that insecure men projected to hide their fears. But his eyes held intelligence, a calculating quality that marked him as more than just a thug. This was someone who planned, who thought strategically, who wouldn't be easily intimidated or outmaneuvered. Jack clicked through images of the Iron Skulls compound, a sprawling property outside Harrison that local cops had tried and failed to raid multiple times. The place was fortified like a military installation. High fences, cameras, guards. Victor had built himself a kingdom, and he ran it with the same tactical precision he'd learned in the Rangers. A thought occurred to Jack, cold and ugly. What if this wasn't just about money? What if Victor had personal reasons for targeting Silver Creek specifically? Jack pulled up more files, cross-referencing names and dates, looking for connections. And there it was, James Kane, convicted of armed robbery and murder in 1998, arrested by Detective Jack Malone of the NYPD, sentenced to 25 to life, died in prison in 2002 after a fight with another inmate. James Kane, Victor's older brother. Jack sat back, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't random expansion. Victor knew exactly who he was targeting. The question was whether Walt's Tavern was chosen specifically because of Jack's connection or if it was coincidental. Either way, the confrontation on Friday had just become exponentially more complicated. He needed to know more. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts until he found Detective Rachel Martinez, his old partner from his final years at NYPD. She was probably asleep. It was past midnight in New York, but this couldn't wait. She answered on the fourth ring, voice groggy. Malone, this better be good. Victor Kane. What do you know about him? A pause as she woke up fully. Jesus, Jack, that's going back. Why? Because he's here in Montana, running a criminal organization. And I'm pretty sure he's targeting me personally. He heard sheets rustling, imagined Rachel sitting up and reaching for the case files she probably still kept, even though Jack's old cases were technically closed. Give me 10 minutes, I'll call you back. The wait felt eternal. Jack paced his cabin, mind racing through implications. If Victor blamed him for his brother's arrest, then Friday night wasn't just about money or territory. It was about revenge. And revenge made people reckless, unpredictable, dangerous in ways that simple criminal enterprise didn't. Rachel called back 12 minutes later. Okay, pulled the file. Victor Kane, younger brother of James Kane. He testified at James's trial, said you planted evidence and coerced a confession. Judge threw out the testimony as unreliable. Victor went ballistic in the courtroom, had to be removed by marshals, made threats against you specifically, said someday when you were old and thought you were safe, he'd make you pay for destroying his family. Jack felt ice in his veins. I don't remember that. You got death threats 3 times a week back then. Can't blame you for not remembering one more. Rachel's tone turned serious. Jack, if this guy's been nursing a grudge for 25 years, you're in serious danger. Call the FBI, call U.S. Marshals, call someone with actual resources. And say what? That a motorcycle gang leader might be holding a grudge? They'll file a report and tell me to call if anything actually happens. Then leave. Get out of Montana. Let someone else deal with this. Jack almost laughed. Rachel, I'm 68 years old. I've got maybe 10 good years left if I'm lucky. I'm not spending them running from some punk who thinks revenge will fill whatever hole his brother's death left in him. God damn it, Jack. You're still the same stubborn ass who refused to wear a vest on patrol. This isn't about courage. It's about being smart enough to know when you're outgunned. I'm always outgunned. Hasn't stopped me yet. Rachel sighed heavily. Fine. But promise me you'll at least stack the deck in your favor. Get local law enforcement involved. Document everything. Make sure if this goes sideways, there's evidence to nail Victor regardless of what happens to you. I promise. Liar. She knew him too well. Just try not to die, okay? I'm too old to break in a new friend. After she hung up, Jack sat in silence processing the new information. Victor Kane wasn't just a criminal. He was a man on a mission of vengeance. Someone who'd spent 2 decades building power, specifically so he could someday hurt the man who'd arrested his brother. Friday night wasn't going to be a simple shakedown. It was going to be a reckoning. He should have felt afraid. Instead, he felt a strange calm settle over him. At least now he knew the score. At least the enemy had a face and a motive, and could be understood in tactical terms rather than abstract threat. Jack Malone had spent his entire life preparing for confrontations like this, even if he'd hoped to avoid them in his twilight years. Sleep finally came around 2 a.m., fitful but enough to keep him functional. Thursday morning arrived with gray skies and the smell of coming rain. Jack went through his routine, run, shower, breakfast, with mechanical precision, his body moving while his mind continued planning. The shop saw lighty traffic, a few customers buying ammunition, one older couple taking a beginner firearms course Jack offered twice a week. He moved through the teaching with patient focus, emphasizing safety and responsibility over tactical applications. These were civilians who wanted to protect their homes, not soldiers preparing for war. They didn't need to know about the storm brewing for tomorrow night. Around noon, a young man pushed through the door with obvious nervousness. Jack recognized him immediately. Jake Torres, mid-20s, Marine Corps tattoos visible on his forearms. He'd seen Jake around town occasionally, always with the iron skulls, and had pegged him as someone who'd gone looking for Brotherhood after military service and found it in the wrong place. Jake approached the counter, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly. Mr. Malone, I need to talk to you. Private, Jack gestured to the back room. Jake followed, radiating anxiety like heat. I'm Jake Torres, 4th Marines, Helmand Province, 2016 to 2018. Got out, couldn't adjust, joined the skulls thinking it was Brotherhood like the core. His words came fast, tumbling over each other, but it's not. It's just organized crime. And I'm tired of it. Tired of hurting people who don't deserve it. Jack waited, letting him get it out. Tomorrow night, Victor's not just collecting from Walt. He's making an example. Bringing 20 extra guys, most of them mercenaries he's hired from out of state. Planning to trash the place, hurt anyone who resists, send a message to the whole town. Jake met his eyes, and he knows you'll be there. He wants you specifically. Says you're the reason his brother died in prison. So I heard. Jack kept his voice neutral. Why are you telling me this? Because you remind me of my platoon sergeant. Man who taught me what honor actually means, not the bullshit macho posturing the skulls pass off as Brotherhood. Jake's hands trembled slightly. Watching you stand up to them the other day, even though you're, no offense, old as hell, it made me remember who I used to be. Before I let myself become someone my sergeant would be ashamed of. What's your plan? Tonight I'm leaving the skulls. Probably get killed for it, but better dead with honor than alive without it. Wanted to warn you first, give you a chance to prepare. Jake's jaw tightened. They're coming dinging 40 men, Mr. Malone. Even if you're as good as people say, those are bad odds. Jack studied the young Marine in front of him, seeing echoes of his own younger self, idealistic, lost, looking for purpose in a world that seemed determined to strip meaning from everything. Marines didn't stop being Marines just because they took off the uniform. The programming ran too deep, the values too fundamental to abandon even when the circumstances of life pushed them toward darkness. Jake, you leave the skulls and you're not alone. You're with us, with the veterans in this town who remember what service actually means. Jack let that sink in. Tomorrow night, I'll need someone watching the perimeter while we handle the situation inside. Someone with combat experience and tactical awareness. Think you can do that? Hope lit Jake's face like sunrise. Yes, sir, absolutely. They spent the next hour going over details, the layout of Walt's tavern, the approach routes Victor's people would likely use, communication plans, fallback positions. Jake had valuable intelligence about the Skull's standard tactics, information that could mean the difference between survival and slaughter. By the time he left through the back door to avoid being seen, Jack felt marginally better about their chances. Marginally. The afternoon dragged. Every customer felt like a distraction from planning, every quiet moment filled with scenarios and calculations. Jack closed the shop an hour early, unable to maintain the pretense of normalcy any longer. He needed to prepare in ways that went beyond mental rehearsal. Back at his cabin, he unlocked the case under his bed and began assembling gear. Tactical vest with ceramic plates capable of stopping rifle rounds. Extra magazines for his 1911, each loaded with hollow point ammunition designed for maximum stopping power. Combat knife in a boot sheath. First aid kit with combat gauze and tourniquets. Flashlight with momentary on switch for target identification in low light. He laid everything out on his bed, creating a checklist in his mind. Then he began putting it on, adjusting straps and checking load-bearing balance. The vest felt heavier than he remembered, or maybe he was just weaker. Either way, he'd deal. Marines didn't complain about discomfort when lives were at stake. A knock at the door startled him. He grabbed his 1911, approached carefully, checked through the window. Maya stood on his porch, looking grim. He opened the door. She took in his tactical setup without comment, just nodded as if confirming what she'd expected. Word is Jake Torres defected today. Victor's going nuclear. Tomorrow night's going to be worse than we thought. Jack stepped aside, letting her in. How much worse? Maya pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket. I've got friends still active duty, people who monitor domestic threats. Made some calls, called in favors. She flipped pages. Victor's been recruiting for the past week. Ex-military, private contractors, anyone with combat experience willing to work for cash. Current estimate is 60 fighters, maybe more. And they're bringing serious firepower, AR-15s, body armor, possibly explosives. Jack felt the weight of those numbers. 60 trained fighters versus what? Him, Maya, Jake, Walt, maybe Sheriff Tom if he bent the rules enough to participate. 5 people against 60, even with home field advantage, wasn't a fight. It was a massacre waiting to happen. "We need to call this off," Maya said quietly. "Evacuate Walt, get everyone out, let Victor take the tavern, and then fight him legally afterward. He'll burn it to the ground out of spite, and then move on to the next business and the next. Where does it stop?" When we're all dead, apparently. Maya's frustration was visible. "Mr. Malone, I respect what you're trying to do, but suicide missions went out of style after Vietnam. We need to be smart about this. Smart would have been walking away 3 days ago, but we didn't, and now we're committed." Jack met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to die for this. If you want out, I understand. But I'm staying. Walt's my brother. Not by blood, but by every other measure that matters. I won't abandon him." Maya studied him for a long moment, some internal debate playing out behind her eyes. Then she nodded slowly. "Fine, but we do it my way. Get actual support, real resources, not just stubborn old men pretending that they're still 25. What do you suggest?" She pulled out her phone and started texting. "I know 15 veterans in the surrounding counties, all combat experienced, all willing to help when the cause is right. Give me 2 hours and I can have them here with weapons and tactical gear." She looked up. "We won't win, but we can make it costly enough that Victor thinks twice about expanding further." Jack wanted to refuse, didn't want to pull more people into danger. But Maya was right. Pride wouldn't stop bullets, and stubbornness wasn't a tactical advantage. If they were going to make a stand, they needed every edge they could manufacture. Make the calls. She stepped outside for privacy. Jack continued his preparations, adding spare batteries for his flashlight, checking his first aid supplies, making sure everything was positioned for quick access under stress. The routine was calming in its familiarity, muscle memory from decades of pre-deployment preparations. Maya returned 15 minutes later. 12 confirmed, 3 maybe. They'll be here tomorrow morning for briefing. She hesitated. "Mr. Malone, most of these guys have been out for 5 to 10 years. They're not active duty sharp. We'll need time to coordinate, establish communication protocols, make sure we're not just armed civilians shooting in every direction once the chaos starts. Can you handle that, the tactical coordination?" Her expression hardened into something fierce. "I coordinated operations in Kandahar against enemies who'd been fighting longer than I'd been alive. I think I can handle a bunch of biker criminals in Montana." "Fair enough," Jack allowed himself a small smile. "Welcome to the team, Captain." She snorted. "Sergeant, never made it to officer rank. Too much combat, not enough politics." They spent the next hour going over the tavern's layout using a sketch Jack had drawn earlier. Maya pointed out defensive positions, kill zones, vulnerable approaches. Her tactical mind was sharp, years of special forces training evident in the way she thought 3 steps ahead, anticipated enemy moves, planned contingencies for every scenario. By the time she left, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in days: hope. They were still outnumbered and outgunned, but they weren't helpless. They had skills, experience, and most importantly, a cause worth fighting for. Victor Kane wanted revenge and money. Jack's team was protecting their home. That asymmetry of motivation mattered more than people realize. Dinner was protein and carbs, fuel for tomorrow. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing. His mind had already shifted into combat mode, that strange dissociative state where emotions receded and cold calculation took over. It was both familiar and terrifying. This part of himself he'd tried to bury for decades, suddenly emerging as if it had never left. The phone rang. Danny's name lit up the screen. Jack's son, who he hadn't spoken to in 3 months after their last argument about what? He couldn't even remember. The specifics of their dysfunction had blurred together over the years into a general sense of failure and disappointment on both sides. "Dad?" Danny's voice carried worry. "I saw something online about motorcycle gangs in Montana. Sheriff's Department put out a warning. You okay?" "I'm fine." Jack kept his voice neutral. "Just some local trouble. Nothing that concerns you. Mom's gone 5 years and you still can't be honest with me." Danny's frustration was palpable. "I'm 40 years old, Dad. I can handle knowing if you are in danger." The words hung between them, decades of unspoken resentment compressed into one sentence. Jack wanted to explain that protection had been his love language, that keeping Danny safe meant shielding him from the darkness that Jack himself carried. But explaining wouldn't change anything, would just open old wounds they'd both learned to navigate around. There's a situation developing tomorrow night. Nothing I can't handle, but if something goes wrong, I want you to know I'm proud of you. You became a better man than I ever was. Silence stretched long enough that Jack thought the connection had dropped. Then Danny spoke, voice thick with emotion. Jesus, Dad, you're planning something stupid, aren't you? Something heroic and suicidal and completely unnecessary? Just doing what needs doing, taking care of friends, protecting people who can't protect themselves. You know, the things I taught you. You taught me a lot of things, mostly how to bury feelings in duty until everyone who loves you gives up trying to reach you. The truth of that hit harder than any physical blow could have. Danny was right. Jack had been an absent presence through most of his son's childhood, physically there, but emotionally locked away behind walls of trauma and stoicism that even Sarah had struggled to breach. He justified it as protecting his family from his demons, but really it had been cowardice dressed up as sacrifice. Danny, if I don't make it through tomorrow, you're going to make it because I'm driving out there tonight. Should arrive around noon tomorrow. Danny's voice carried stubborn determination that sounded exactly like Jack. And before you tell me to stay away, remember that you don't get to decide that anymore. I'm coming whether you want me there or not. The line went dead. Jack stood holding his phone, feeling something crack open in his chest. His son was coming. Despite everything, despite years of distance and disappointment, Danny was choosing to stand with him. The knowledge brought equal parts terror and gratitude. He called Maya back. My son's arriving tomorrow. He's not military, not trained. Might complicate things. Family usually does. But we'll work around it. Maybe keep him perimeter with Jake, somewhere relatively safe. Relatively being the operative word. After hanging up, Jack sat in his cabin, surrounded by tactical gear and the accumulated weight of 6 decades of choices. Tomorrow night would either validate every stand he'd ever taken or prove that stubbornness was just another word for stupidity. Either way, at least he'd face it with people he cared about, doing something that mattered. The night passed slowly. Jack didn't sleep, just lay in bed watching the ceiling and listening to his cabin settle around him. Every creak might be an intruder, every distant sound potentially hostile. His nervous system thrummed with adrenaline, body preparing for threat even though logic said the attack wouldn't come until tomorrow. Around 3 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text from Walt. Can't sleep, you? Jack replied, same, big day tomorrow. Walt, scared shitless if I'm honest. Jack, good. Fear keeps you sharp, Walt. We're going to die, aren't we? Jack stared at the question, knowing Walt deserved honesty. Maybe, probably not. But if we do, we'll die standing. Better than living on our knees. Walt, Sarah would have hated this. Jack, Sarah hated everything that risked losing me. But she understood duty. She'd have hated it and supported it simultaneously. Walt, I miss her. She was good for you, kept you human. The conversation trailed off, neither of them finding more words. Jack set his phone aside and stared into darkness, thinking about Sarah and all the ways he'd failed to be the husband and father she deserved. She'd loved him anyway, loved him through the nightmares, in the distance, and the way duty always seemed to come first. Her grace had been the one pure thing in his life, and losing her had felt like losing his soul. But maybe that was dramatic. Maybe he'd just lost his excuse for not dealing with his demons. With Sarah gone, he'd had to face himself honestly, and what he'd found was a 63-year-old man who'd spent his entire adult life fighting but didn't know how to live in peace. Moving to Montana had been an attempt to learn, but apparently peace required more than geography. It required internal transformation he wasn't sure he was capable of. Dawn finally arrived, gray and cold. Jack went through his morning routine mechanically, every action automatic. The run felt different today, each footfall potentially one of his last on this earth. The mountains looked sharper, the air tasted cleaner, colors seemed more vivid. This was how it felt before combat, everything heightened, present in ways that ordinary life never achieved. He showered and dressed in dark jeans and a flannel shirt that concealed the shoulder holster. Normal clothes for an abnormal day. The tactical vest and combat gear waited in a duffel bag by his door, ready to be donned when the time came. Danny arrived just after noon, driving a rental SUV and looking like he hadn't slept either. He climbed out stiffly, still wearing his corporate lawyer clothes, khakis and a button-down that probably cost more than Jack's entire wardrobe. They stood in the cabin's driveway, separated by 3 feet of distance and 40 years of complicated history. "You look like hell," Danny said, "right back at you." They moved toward each other hesitantly, then embraced with the awkward intensity of men who loved each other but had forgotten how to show it. Jack felt his son's arms around him and realized how much he'd missed this. Missed the simple human connection that pride and stubbornness had stolen from them. "You shouldn't be here," Jack said into Danny's shoulder. "Neither should you. But here we are." They pulled apart, both blinking away moisture that neither would acknowledge. Jack led him inside, poured coffee, explained the situation with more honesty than he'd originally intended. Danny listened without interrupting, lawyer brain processing information and calculating risks. "So let me get this straight. 60 armed criminals led by a guy with a personal vendetta against you, versus you, a bartender, a defector, and whatever ragtag group of veterans you've assembled. And your plan is to just fight them?" Jack shrugged. "When you say it like that, it sounds insane." "That's because it is insane, Dad. This isn't Vietnam. You can't just charge forward and hope superior moral righteousness stops bullets." The criticism stung because it was accurate. Jack knew the odds were terrible, knew he was potentially leading people to their deaths based on principle rather than tactical soundness. But he also knew that sometimes principle was all you had. That standing for something was worth the risk, even when the math didn't work out. "I won't force you to stay," Jack said quietly. "You came, you showed your support. That's enough. Go back to Denver. Live your life. Don't watch your father make potentially the stupidest decision of his many stupid decisions." Danny set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "You really don't get it, do you? You think I'm here because of duty or guilt or some obligation to the old man who barely raised me." His voice rose. "I'm here because despite everything, despite the distance and the disappointment and the years of feeling like I wasn't enough to hold your attention, you're still my father. And I'm not leaving you to face this alone." The words hung between them, raw and honest in ways their relationship rarely allowed. Jack felt something break open in his chest, some calcified barrier crumbling under the weight of his son's fierce loyalty. "You don't know how to fight," Jack managed. "Then teach me. You've got, what, 7 hours until this goes down? Teach me enough to not get myself killed immediately." Jack led Danny to the shooting range behind his cabin, the morning chill biting through their shirts as they walked in silence. The targets hung at various distances, paper silhouettes that had absorbed thousands of rounds over the years. Danny moved with the careful uncertainty of someone entering unfamiliar territory, and Jack felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders, teaching his son to fight when he should have been teaching him to live in peace. The 1911 felt heavy in Danny's untrained hands, awkward in a way that made Jack's instructor instincts flare. He positioned his son's grip, adjusted his stance, demonstrated the fundamentals with patient precision. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, arms extended but not locked. The lesson took him back to when Danny was 8, teaching him to throw a baseball with the same careful attention to form and follow-through. That memory carried sweetness and regret in equal measure. So few moments like that, so many opportunities lost to duty and distance. "Your mother tried to get me to take you shooting when you were younger," Jack said as Danny lined up his first shot. "I refused. Thought if I kept you away from guns, you'd grow up different than me. Safer. Better." Danny squeezed the trigger, the shot going wide and low. The recoil surprised him despite Jack's warnings. "Did it work? Am I better? You're alive and successful and not haunted by the ghosts of men you've killed." Jack reloaded the magazine. "So yes, better." They spent 2 hours on basic marksmanship, Danny's groups tightening incrementally as muscle memory started forming. He'd never be a natural shooter. His hands shook slightly, his breathing never quite synced with the trigger squeeze, anticipation pulling his shots off target. But he learned fast, absorbed corrections, showed the same stubborn determination that had made him a successful attorney despite his father's neglect. The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their training. Jack checked his watch, 2 p.m. Maya's reinforcements arriving exactly on schedule. They walked back to find a small convoy of pickup trucks and SUVs parked haphazardly around his property, veterans climbing out and stretching road-weary bodies. Maya stood in the center like a general surveying her troops, clipboard in hand, radiating the competent authority that came from leading men under fire. She'd changed into tactical pants and a black t-shirt, her hair pulled back severely, every inch the Special Forces sergeant she'd been before civilian life softened her edges. The veterans gathered around her came in all shapes and ages, some younger than Danny, others pushing 70 like Walt, but all carrying themselves with the particular awareness of people who'd seen combat and survived. Jack recognized a few faces from regional VA meetings. Marcus Chen, early 30s, Marine Corps tattoos visible on forearms scarred by shrapnel. Sarah Mitchell, late 20s, Navy corpsman turned EMT, her medical bag already slung over one shoulder. Danny Walsh, pushing 70, Vietnam-era Army Ranger, who still moved like he could clear a room despite the cane he leaned on. 12 veterans total, maybe 13 if Jake Torres had successfully extracted himself from the Iron Skulls overnight without getting killed. Maya waved Jack over. Introductions were brief and functional. Names, military backgrounds, skill assessments delivered in shorthand that only veterans understood. MOS and deployment zones, weapons proficiency and medical training. The abbreviated language of people who'd lived the same nightmare in different locations. Jack felt something loosen in his chest as he took in this collection of warriors who'd driven hours on short notice to stand with strangers against a common threat. Danny Walsh spoke first. His Boston accent thick despite 50 years away from home. Heard you're planning to make a stand against some punk bikers. Count me in. Been too long since I reminded anyone that Rangers lead the way. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her medical bag. I brought trauma supplies, combat gauze, tourniquets, chest seals. If this goes kinetic, we'll have casualties. Better I'm here than explaining to families afterward why nobody with medical training showed up. One by one they committed, these broken veterans finding purpose in defending a town most had never visited, supporting people they'd never met. Jack understood the psychology. They weren't here for Silver Creek specifically. They were here because Maya had called and because brothers answered brothers, and because the prospect of violence gave temporary relief from the particular boredom of civilian life after military service. He should have felt guilty about that, about using their restlessness and loyalty for his own ends. Instead, he just felt grateful. They moved the briefing inside Jack's gun shop, the group crowding around a large map of Silver Creek that Maya had printed and annotated with tactical markers. She ran the meeting with professional efficiency, laying out the situation without sugarcoating the odds. 60 hostile fighters, most with military or criminal experience. Unknown weapons loadout, but assumed rifles and body armor. Primary target was Walt's Tavern, but collateral damage to the town was probable if things escalated badly. Our objective isn't to win, Maya said flatly. It's to make victory so costly that Victor Kane reconsiders his expansion plans. We hold the tavern, we protect civilians, we inflict maximum casualties on his force while minimizing our own. If we can do that, he'll look for easier targets elsewhere. Marcus Chen raised his hand. Rules of engagement? Self-defense only. They shoot first, we return fire. They breach, we repel. But we're not executing surrendering combatants or pursuing fleeing enemies. Jack's voice carried the authority of 3 decades wearing a badge. This is defense, not revenge. Anyone who can't follow those parameters should leave now. Nobody moved. Jack studied their faces, seeing determination mixed with fear, mixed with something else. Excitement, maybe, or relief at having a mission again after years of aimless drifting. He knew that feeling intimately, the way purpose clarified everything, even when the purpose involved potential death. Maya divided them into teams. 3-person squads assigned to defensive positions throughout the tavern. Second-floor windows for overwatch. Ground floor covering approaches. Basement fallback position if the main level became untenable. She designated Danny Walsh as their combat engineer despite his age, tasking him with reinforcing entry points and creating obstacles that would slow any breach attempts. Sarah Mitchell would establish a casualty collection point in the basement with supplies pre-positioned for rapid treatment. Jake Torres arrived mid-briefing, slipping through the back door with fresh bruises on his face and dried blood under his nose. Victor sent people after me last night. Didn't kill me, but made it clear I'm a dead man if they find me again. He looked at the assembled veterans with something like awe. You all came. Marines take care of Marines, Marcus said simply, even the lost ones. They spent the next 4 hours transforming Walt's Tavern into a defensive position, working with the controlled urgency of people who understood that preparation meant survival. Danny Walsh directed the fortification with crusty competence, using materials from local hardware stores to reinforce doors and create firing positions that offered protection while maintaining sight lines. They boarded windows strategically, leaving gaps that could serve as gun ports. They pre-positioned fire extinguishers and first aid kits, mapped every exit and hiding spot, turned a civilian bar into something resembling a forward operating base. Walt watched the transformation with emotions playing across his weathered face, gratitude and guilt and growing horror at what his tavern was becoming. He pulled Jack aside while the others worked, voice low and strained. This is my fault. I should have just paid them. Should have avoided all this. Jack gripped his shoulder. You did nothing wrong. They came to your business and made illegal demands. Everything that happens tonight is on them, not you. People might die because I was too stubborn to write a check. People might die because Victor Kane is a criminal who thinks violence solves problems. Jack's tone sharpened. Don't take responsibility for his choices. That's how bullies win. They make you feel guilty for their actions, make you think you caused the harm by resisting instead of submitting. Walt nodded but didn't look convinced. Jack understood that too. Survivor's guilt started before the actual survival, manifesting as anticipatory remorse for violence not yet committed. They'd both carried that weight since Vietnam, the knowledge that their continued existence came at the cost of others' deaths. It never got easier, just more familiar. Danny worked alongside the veterans with focused determination, his lawyer softness giving way to something harder as the afternoon wore on. He hauled sandbags and moved furniture and followed instructions without complaint, earning nods of approval from men who'd initially dismissed him as privileged civilian. Jack watched his son adapt and felt pride mixed with sorrow. Proud that Danny could rise to challenge, sorrowful that he'd created circumstances requiring it. Sheriff Tom Diaz arrived around 5 p.m., accompanied by his 3 deputies. He took in the fortifications and armed veterans with a cop's assessing gaze, calculating legal exposure and political fallout. Officially, I'm here to maintain public order and prevent violence. Unofficially, I served in the Marines and I'll be damned if I let criminals take over my county without a fight. What's your official stance if shooting starts? Maya's question was direct, lawyer sharp despite her military background. Self-defense is legal in Montana. Tom met her eyes. If 60 armed men assault a building containing lawful citizens, those citizens have every right to defend themselves with proportional force. My job is to document everything and make sure nobody crosses the line from defense to execution. He positioned his deputies strategically, one at the fire station with direct line of sight to the tavern, one at the medical clinic ready to receive casualties, one mobile to coordinate with state police when they finally arrived. The setup gave them plausible deniability while ensuring rapid response if things escalated beyond control. Smart politics married to tactical necessity. The sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting Silver Creek in shades of amber and shadow. Jack stood outside the tavern, watching light fade from the sky, feeling the familiar pre-combat clarity settle over him. This was real now, no longer abstract planning, but imminent violence. In 3 hours, maybe 4, Victor Kane would arrive with his small army, and the civilized pretense would drop away, revealing the ugly truth that society was only 1 layer deep, and underneath still lurked the same tribal warfare that had defined human existence since caves and clubs. Danny joined him on the sidewalk, silent presence communicating more than words could. They stood together as father and son, watching their last peaceful sunset, both understanding that whatever happened tonight would fundamentally change them. Violence marked people, left scars deeper than skin, altered the way you process the world forever after. Jack had hoped to spare Danny that transformation. Now he could only hope they both survived it. "You scared?" Danny finally asked. "Terrified," Jack admitted. "Fears kept me alive through worse situations than this. The trick is using it instead of letting it use you. How do you do that? You focus on the mission, on protecting the people beside you, on doing the next right thing regardless of outcome." Jack turned to face his son, and when it's over, when the adrenaline fades and the reality sets in, you remember that fear was wisdom trying to keep you safe. You don't be ashamed of it. "Were you scared in Vietnam?" Every single day, Jack's throat tightened with memory. Woke up scared, went to sleep scared, spent every moment in between managing fear that wanted to paralyze me. But I had brothers depending on me, and duty greater than self-preservation. Same as tonight, they returned inside where the other veterans were conducting final weapons checks and reviewing assignments. The atmosphere carried the peculiar calm of warriors at peace with impending violence. That Zen state where acceptance of potential death paradoxically made you more effective at preventing it. Jack moved among them offering words of encouragement and tactical reminders, falling easily into the leadership role that 6 decades of service had ingrained. Maya pulled him aside, expression troubled. "Just got word from a contact. Victor's bringing more than 60. Latest count is 75, maybe 80. He's calling in every favor, recruiting hardcore criminals from 3 states. This isn't just about your tavern anymore. He's making a statement about his power, showing everyone in Montana that resistance is futile." Jack absorbed the new numbers without external reaction, though internally his tactical calculations were spinning frantically. 80 versus 15 was beyond long odds. It was suicide if things went purely kinetic. We need to hurt him fast and hard in the opening moments. Make it so costly that even with numerical advantage, his people start questioning whether the paycheck is worth it. "Agreed." Maya pointed to the map. "I'm positioning our best shooters here and here, covering the 2 most likely approach routes. First wave catches maximum fire before they even reach the building. Shock and awe, Special Forces style." They finalized details as the clock crawled toward 8 p.m. The waiting was always hardest, Jack remembered from Vietnam. Those final minutes before contact when your mind conjured every possible disaster and your body hummed with adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Some veterans talked compulsively during these stretches, filling silence with chatter that meant nothing. Others retreated into themselves, finding calm in the eye of the storm. Jack had always been the latter, and now he sat in a corner of the tavern, cleaning his 1911 for the 3rd time, the familiar ritual soothing in its pointlessness. Walt served coffee to anyone who wanted it, his contribution to the coming battle being hospitality because he couldn't offer tactical expertise. The man had served with honor in Vietnam, but that was 50 years ago, and tremors in his hands made shooting accurately nearly impossible now. Instead, he ensured everyone had caffeine and bathroom access and words of gratitude that came straight from his soul. 7:30 arrived with sudden violence, not physical, but emotional as the reality crystallized. This was happening. In 30 minutes, maybe less, Victor Kane would arrive with his army, and the talking would stop and bullets would fly, and people Jack cared about might die because he'd been too stubborn to walk away. The weight of that responsibility pressed down like physical force, making it hard to breathe. Danny found him in the midst of that moment, put a hand on his shoulder without speaking. The contact grounded Jack, reminded him why he fought, not for abstract principles, but for specific people, for the son he'd failed too often, for the friend who'd saved his life decades ago, for the veterans who'd answered a call they did not have to answer. Their trust demanded his best effort, regardless of outcome. Maya's voice crackled over the radio network they'd established. All stations, multiple vehicles approaching from the east. Count at least 40 motorcycles, plus support vehicles. ETA 3 minutes. Weapons hot, safety's off. Fire only on my command or in self-defense. The transformation was instant. Veterans moving to assigned positions with practiced efficiency, nervous energy converting to focused intensity. Jack chambered around in his 1911, the mechanical sound loud in sudden silence. Beside him, Danny checked his borrowed pistol with shaking hands, clearly terrified but present anyway. That courage meant more than any skill could. Through the fortified windows, Jack heard them before he saw them. The thunder of motorcycle engines growing louder, filling the evening air with mechanical rage. The Iron Skulls were announcing their arrival, psychological warfare through sound and spectacle. Victor understood theater, knew that fear multiplied through anticipation. The motorcycles materialized through the dusk like mechanical locusts, their headlights cutting pale scars across Main Street as they rolled toward Walt's Tavern in a choreographed display of menace. Jack counted engines, his detective mind automatically cataloging details, even as his warrior instincts screamed warnings. 43 bikes in the first wave, riders wearing Iron Skulls patches like uniforms, their faces hidden behind dark visors that dehumanized them into interchangeable threats. Behind the motorcycles came pickup trucks and SUVs, windows tinted black, carrying reinforcements that Victor had recruited from the criminal underworld. Jack's tactical assessment went from bad to catastrophic as the vehicles kept coming. 75, 80, maybe more. They surrounded the tavern in a loose perimeter, engines idling in syncopated rhythm that felt deliberately designed to rattle nerves. Victor Kane dismounted from the lead motorcycle with theatrical slowness, removing his helmet to reveal a face that matched the intelligence photos but carried more intensity in person. He was 45 and looked it, hard living etched in the lines around his mouth, violence visible in the casual way he moved through space like he owned it. Prison tattoos covered his neck and knuckles, a visual resume of time served and lessons learned in places where weakness meant death. His Lieutenant Marcus Delacroix flanked him, a smaller man who somehow projected more danger through sheer competence. Ex-Green Beret, Jack remembered from his research. The kind of soldier who'd learned to kill efficiently in a dozen countries before bringing those skills home. He scanned the tavern's fortifications with professional assessment, calculating fields of fire and weak points with the same methodology Jack had used hours earlier. Victor raised a bullhorn, his amplified voice cutting through engine noise with practiced authority. "Jack Malone, I know you're in there. Come out and we can settle this between men. No need for all these innocent people to die because you're too proud to face your past." Jack keyed his radio, speaking quietly to the veteran's position throughout the building. "Hold fire. Let him talk himself out." Through a gap in the boarded windows, he watched Victor pace like a predator, establishing territory. 25 years I've waited for this, old man. 25 years since you arrested my brother on fabricated evidence and sent him to die in prison. You remember Jimmy? Course you do. Every cop remembers the ones who make them look good, who give them medals and promotions built on lies. The accusation stung because it was false, but Jack couldn't prove that from inside a fortified building. Jimmy Kane had been guilty. Surveillance footage, eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, all pointed to him executing a bodega owner during a robbery. Jack's arrest had been clean, by the book, reviewed by internal affairs and found completely legitimate. But Victor had spent 2 decades nursing an alternate reality where his brother was innocent and Jack was corrupt. And no amount of facts would penetrate that delusion now. "You've got 60 seconds to come out," Victor continued. "After that, we come in. And when we do, everyone inside becomes complicit in your sins. Their blood's on your hands, Malone. Just like Jimmy's blood." Sheriff Tom's voice crackled over the police radio band, deliberately loud enough for Victor's people to hear. "This is Sheriff Diaz. You're surrounded by law enforcement. Disperse immediately or face arrest for trespassing, menacing, and conspiracy to commit assault." Victor laughed, the sound harsh and humorless through the bullhorn. "Sheriff, you've got 4 deputies and delusions of authority. I've got 80 men who don't care about badges or laws. You want to arrest us? Come try." The standoff stretched, tension building with each passing second. Jack knew this pattern from hostage negotiations, the aggressor making demands, establishing dominance through threats, waiting for the defender's nerve to break. Victor expected Jack to emerge either in surrender or rage, creating a scenario that could be controlled or exploited. But Jack had learned patience in jungles where premature movement meant death, and he wasn't playing Victor's game. Maya's voice whispered over their tactical net, "I've got clean shots on Victor and Marcus. Say the word." "Negative," Jack replied. "We're not executing anyone. Let him make the first move." Victor's patience expired at the 2-minute mark. His hand signal sent 20 fighters moving toward the tavern's entrances, rifles held ready but not yet aimed. They advanced with military spacing and covering fire protocols. These weren't amateur criminals playing soldier. They were former soldiers playing criminal. The distinction mattered tactically, meant conventional defensive strategies wouldn't suffice against opponents who understood those same strategies. Sheriff Tom stepped into the street, hands visible and empty, placing himself between the advancing fighters and the tavern. This is your final warning. Stand down or face consequences. One of Victor's men, young, early 20s, trying too hard to prove something, raised his rifle toward Tom with the jerky aggression of someone who'd watched too many action movies and not enough actual combat. The kid's finger touched the trigger, intent visible even from a distance, and Jack made the decision that would change everything. The shot from his 1911 took the kid in the shoulder, spinning him sideways and dropping him screaming to the pavement. The sound echoed through Silver Creek like thunder announcing the storm, that irreversible moment when talking stopped and violence began. All stations, weapons free, Jack transmitted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Engage threats, protect civilians, remember your training. The world exploded into chaos. Victor's forces opened fire immediately, muzzle flashes lighting up the twilight as bullets hammered into the tavern's fortifications. Wood splintered, glass shattered in those windows they hadn't boarded, and the distinctive crack of rifle rounds passing close overhead made everyone who'd never experienced combat understand instantly why veterans flinched at fireworks. The veterans themselves moved with practiced efficiency, returning measured fire from defensive positions that Maya had selected precisely for this scenario. Marcus Chen's rifle barked from the second-floor window, 3-round bursts that dropped 2 attackers trying to flank along the alley. Sarah Mitchell called out casualty reports over the radio with clinical detachment, tracking who was hit and how badly. Danny Walsh, ancient Army Ranger channeling muscle memory from 50 years past, coordinated defensive fire with shouted commands that barely carried over the gunfire. Jack moved through the ground floor, his 1911 extended but not firing wildly, waiting for clear targets that presented genuine threats. 2 iron skulls breached the reinforced front door using a battering ram, and Jack's first 2 shots took them center mass before they'd fully entered. Not killing shots necessarily, body armor might save them, but stopping shots that removed them from the fight. Danny stayed close to his father, the borrowed pistol in his shaking hands discharging twice toward threats Jack had already neutralized. The kid was terrified but functional, and that was enough. Combat wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing the job despite fear trying to shut you down. The initial assault broke against their defense like waves on stone. Victor's numerical advantage, negated by narrow approaches and concentrated fire from elevated positions. His fighters pulled back after losing 8 in the first 3 minutes, dragging wounded and regrouping beyond effective rifle range. The brief respite gave Jack's team time to reassess ammunition expenditure, casualties, structural damage. Status reports came rapid fire over the radio. 2 veterans wounded, neither critically. Ammunition at 70%. All defensive positions holding. Victor's forces regrouping at the gas station across the street, visible through rifle scopes as they organized for another push. Maya descended from her overwatch position, face streaked with powder residue, an expression carved from stone. They're going to try something different. That was a probing attack to test our capabilities. Next wave comes harder and smarter. She was right. Victor understood now that frontal assault wouldn't work, that his numerical advantage meant nothing against fortified positions and disciplined fire. He needed either to wait them out, hope they ran out of ammunition or nerve before his own forces lost cohesion, or he needed to fundamentally change the tactical situation. He chose the latter. The Molotov cocktails came arcing through darkness like malevolent fireflies, bottles trailing flames and smashing against the tavern's exterior. Fire spread across the wooden siding with terrifying speed, the old building igniting like it had been waiting decades for this particular form of destruction. Within seconds, smoke began filtering into the ground floor, the acrid smell of burning wood mixing with gunpowder residue to create an atmosphere that was barely breathable. "Basement fallback," Jack ordered, fighting to keep his voice calm. "Everyone downstairs. Now we hold the interior position until fire departments arrives. But the fire department wasn't coming. Victor had positioned fighters to intercept any emergency response, and the distant sound of automatic weapons fire toward the fire station confirmed that Sheriff Tom's coordination plans had been anticipated and countered. They were alone with a burning building and 80 hostiles who just found a winning strategy. The basement was concrete and steel, relatively protected from the fire raging above, but it was also a potential tomb if the structure collapsed. Jack positioned his team at the stairs with interlocking fields of fire, creating a fatal funnel that any attacker would have to navigate. Sarah Mitchell established her casualty collection point in the corner farthest from the stairwell, already treating the 2 wounded veterans with supplies that were depleting faster than anticipated. Victor's voice penetrated even through smoke and flames, the bullhorn making him sound like some demon from hell itself. "Burning alive or surrender, Malone, your choice. Come out and I'll let the others live. Stay inside and you all die screaming." Danny crouched beside Jack in the smoky darkness, soot-covered and bleeding from a minor shrapnel wound. "We're going to die down here, aren't we?" Jack wanted to lie, to offer reassuring platitudes about cavalry arriving in time and justice prevailing over evil. But his son deserved honesty, especially now. "Maybe, probably, but we'll make it so expensive that Victor regrets ever coming here." "That's not reassuring, Dad. Wasn't meant to be. Just truthful." Jack checked his 1911, 3 rounds left in the magazine, 1 spare mag remaining. 30 years of police work, and I never got in a gunfight this sustained. Vietnam, sure, but cops mostly don't shoot people. We just threatened to. The smoke thickened, infiltrating even their basement refuge. Veterans began coughing, eyes watering, effectiveness degrading as oxygen deprivation started affecting judgment and response times. Sarah distributed wet cloths to hold over faces, a stopgap that bought minutes but not salvation. Above them, the tavern groaned and cracked as fire consumed load-bearing structures, the building literally dying around them. Jake Torres appeared through the smoke like a ghost, having entered through an exterior basement access that Jack had forgotten existed. His face was blackened with soot, and his eyes were wild with information. "State police are 10 minutes out. FBI right behind them. Victor's people are starting to break. Half of them are criminals, not soldiers. They signed up for easy intimidation, not a war zone." The news injected hope like adrenaline straight to the heart. 10 minutes. They just had to survive 10 more minutes against fire and smoke and an enemy determined to kill them all. It sounded impossible, but Jack had survived impossible situations before through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. Maya gathered the team leads for rapid consultation. "We push out, break through their perimeter while they're disorganized, get clear of the building before it collapses. Scatter into town, make them hunt us individually instead of besieging a fixed position." It was aggressive, risky, precisely the kind of special forces thinking that either worked brilliantly or got everyone killed. Jack weighed alternatives and found none that didn't end in suffocation or burning. "We go." They organized quickly, 3 teams of 5, staggered exits through different basement access points, each team providing covering fire for the others. It was coordination born from shared military experience, that universal language of small unit tactics that transcended service branch or era. Danny Walsh took point for one team despite his age, Rangers leading the way like always. Marcus Chen commanded another, Marine Corps precision evident in his economical hand signals. Jack led the third with Maya as his second, Danny staying close enough to cover but far enough to have his own field of fire. The breakout happened simultaneously at 3 points, catching Victor's forces by surprise and splitting their response. Jack's team emerged into chaos, burning building behind them, hostile fighters ahead, darkness and smoke obscuring friend from foe. The 1911 in his hand felt like an extension of his will as he engaged targets that presented themselves, each shot measured and deliberate despite the urgency screaming through his nervous system. A fighter rushed him from the left, rifle raised, and Jack pivoted with speed that defied his 68 years. 2 shots center mass dropped the threat before it could complete. Another came from behind, and Danny's borrowed pistol barked twice, the shooter falling away into darkness. Father and son moving in tandem, protecting each other through violence that was both necessary and soul-scarring. They fought their way toward the edge of Victor's perimeter, small unit tactics from different eras blending into effective resistance. Marcus Chen's team hit Victor's command post directly, the Marines creating enough chaos to pull reinforcements away from the other teams. Danny Walsh's Rangers held the center, absorbing pressure that would have overwhelmed less experienced fighters. And Jack's mixed group pushed toward freedom with single-minded determination, leaving bodies and spent brass in their wake. Victor himself confronted Jack in the middle of Main Street, the conflagration of his burning tavern painting everything in hellish orange light. They stood 15 feet apart, both men battered and bloodied, decades of grievance crystallizing into this single moment. Victor's rifle was slung, out of ammunition or jammed, Jack couldn't tell. Jack's 1911 was similarly empty, slide-locked back on an exhausted magazine. The bullhorn lay abandoned. Victor's actual voice was quieter, more human without electronic amplification. You destroyed my family. Your brother destroyed himself. Jack kept his hands visible, not reaching for his spare magazine. I just did my job. Your job was stolen lives. You wore a badge like that made you righteous, but you were just another killer in a costume. Victor's face twisted with rage and grief mixed inseparably. Jimmy was all I had. Our parents were dead. We only had each other, and you took him away. He killed a man during a robbery. The evidence was overwhelming. Jack felt no satisfaction in this confrontation, just exhaustion and sadness. I'm sorry your brother's dead, Victor, but he chose that path, same as you chose this one. They might have stood there forever, two men locked in moral combat that bullets couldn't resolve. But distant sirens cut through the night. State police, FBI, the cavalry that Jake had promised finally arriving to turn this from siege into crime scene. Victor heard them too, calculation replacing rage as he assessed escape routes and legal exposure. This isn't over, he said, backing toward where his remaining forces were mounting a retreat. You might survive tonight, but I'll find you again. Count on it. Jack watched him disappear into chaos, surrounded by fighters who were fleeing rather than defending, the Iron Skull's empire crumbling under law enforcement pressure that should have come hours earlier. Sheriff Tom emerged from cover with his deputies, beginning the grim work of securing casualties and documenting evidence. The fire department arrived and began battling flames that had reduced Walt's Tavern to a collapsing shell. The dawn came cold and gray, revealing Silver Creek transformed into something resembling a war zone. 43 Iron Skulls dead or captured, the rest scattered across Montana with warrants following. Of Jack's defenders, 4 dead, 3 veterans who'd answered Maya's call, and 1 deputy who'd held his position when Prudence suggested retreat. Another dozen wounded, some critically, their sacrifice painting the streets with evidence that freedom was never free. Jack sat on the curb outside what had been his friend's business, watching flames finally surrender to water and foam. Danny collapsed beside him, both men too exhausted for words. Walt joined them eventually, tears streaming down his weathered face as he stared at the destruction of his life's work. I'm sorry, Jack said, the inadequacy of those words almost painful. We couldn't save it. You saved me. Walt's voice broke. You saved this town. The building's just wood and nails. It can be rebuilt. But it wouldn't be the same, Jack knew. Violence marked places like it marked people. Left scars that changed everything fundamentally. Silver Creek would recover, but it would carry this night forever. The memory of when predators came and good men stood, and the cost of that stand was measured in blood and ashes. Maya approached with a phone, expression unreadable. FBI wants a statement. They're calling it domestic terrorism, bringing federal charges against everyone involved with the Iron Skulls. She paused. They also want to talk about your role, whether this was legitimate self-defense or vigilante action. Jack took the phone, knowing he'd spend the next weeks or months or years justifying decisions made in seconds, explaining to people who'd never faced violence why violence had been necessary. The system would judge him, media would debate him, and somewhere in the process, the actual true Truth would get lost beneath political positioning and legal technicality. But he'd lived with judgment before, carried it like a second skin since Vietnam. What mattered wasn't whether society approved of his choices, but whether he could live with them himself. Four defenders dead, weighed against a town freed from criminal occupation. 43 enemies killed or captured, balanced against community members who would sleep safely tonight. The math was ugly but clear. The FBI agents arrived and began their interviews, documenting everything with the thoroughness that federal cases required. Jack answered honestly, provided evidence, made no excuses. Yes, he'd anticipated violence. Yes, he'd assembled an armed force. Yes, people had died under his command. And yes, he'd do it all again if circumstances repeated, because sometimes the only choice was between bad and worse. Danny stayed beside him through the interrogation, silent moral support that meant more than any legal defense. When the agents finally released Jack pending further investigation, father and son walked together through Silver Creek as the town woke to aftermath. Businesses opened cautiously, residents emerged to assess damage, and slowly the community began processing what had happened on their streets. Mrs. Patterson brought coffee and sandwiches, refusing payment when Jack tried to offer money. Tommy Rodriguez helped clear debris, the teenager working alongside veterans with the kind of courage Jack wished he'd possessed at that age. Sheriff Tom coordinated cleanup and security, ensuring Victor's scattered forces couldn't regroup for reprisal. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of statements and funerals and news coverage that swung between calling Jack a hero and a menace depending on political orientation. The veterans who'd fought beside him scattered back to their homes, carrying their wounds and memories and the knowledge that they'd stood for something real. Maya accepted the FBI's job offer, moving into counterterrorism work where her skills would serve national rather than local causes. Jake Torres stayed in Silver Creek, helping rebuild Walt's Tavern alongside the old Marine himself. They worked slowly but steadily, construction providing rhythm and purpose, while both men processed what they'd survived. The new building would be modern and safer. But Walt insisted on maintaining the memorial wall, the photographs of service members bearing witness to sacrifice across generations. 3 months after that night, Jack received word that Victor Kane had been captured trying to flee into Canada. Federal charges stacked so high that plea bargaining would still mean life in prison. The vendetta that had consumed him for 2 decades was finished, leaving only emptiness and consequences. Jack felt no satisfaction in Victor's capture, just weary recognition that violence perpetuated itself until someone chose to stop the cycle. Danny moved to Silver Creek permanently, opening a small law practice that focused on veterans' affairs and civil rights cases. The distance between father and son had been burned away in the crucible of that night, replaced with understanding that neither could fully articulate, but both could feel. They had dinner weekly, sometimes talking about the battle, mostly talking about everything else. Sarah, the future, the price of trying to be good in a world that rewarded ruthlessness. On the anniversary of the siege, they gathered at the rebuilt tavern for a memorial ceremony. The town turned out in force, grateful and grieving in equal measure. 4 names carved in stone, 4 lives ended defending people they'd barely known, 4 debts that could never be repaid, only honored. Jack spoke briefly about sacrifice and duty, his voice steady until he reached the part about how the dead deserved better than what they'd received, how every battle victory was really just a catalog of losses made necessary by others' evil. Walt reopened the tavern that evening, and the community filled it with careful celebration. The building smelled of fresh paint and new lumber, the past literally built over but not forgotten. Veterans gathered in their usual corner, swapping stories and silences with the easy camaraderie of people who'd shared hell. Jake tended bar with efficient grace, his defection from the Iron Skulls transformed into redemption through honest work. Jack sat with Danny and Maya and the surviving defenders, raising glasses to the dead and the living and the complicated territory between. His body ached with age and injury, his mind carried fresh ghosts to join the old ones, but his conscience was clear. They'd made a stand when standing was required, fought when fighting was necessary, and survived to rebuild what violence had destroyed. The mountains beyond Silver Creek caught the sunset, painting peaks in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Jack why he'd moved here seeking peace. Peace remained elusive, probably always would for men who'd seen what he'd seen. But moments like this came close enough. Good people gathered in safety, community restored through sacrifice, the knowledge that evil had been faced and beaten back, even if only temporarily. Danny raised his glass in toast. To the ones who stood. Jack clinked his glass against his son's, the sound clear and bright in the tavern's warmth. And to the ones who fell, may we prove worthy of their sacrifice. They drank, and in that moment, surrounded by friends and purpose and the hard-won peace of battles survived, Jack Malone felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not happiness exactly, that would be asking too much from a life like his, but contentment, the sense that his years had meant something, that the violence he'd carried and committed had ultimately served protection rather than destruction. Outside, Silver Creek settled into evening, under stars that had witnessed everything and judged nothing. The night carried echoes of that other night, but softer now, integrated into the town's story rather than dominating it. And somewhere in the mountains, in small cabins and quiet homes, veterans slept with slightly less nightmare weight, knowing they'd answered the call when it came and proven that age didn't retire courage, only refined it. Jack walked home with Danny beside him, father and son comfortable in shared silence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, investigations ongoing, physical therapy for his injuries, the slow work of healing that never fully completed. But tonight was for rest, for gratitude, for the simple, profound gift of surviving another day in a world that had tried repeatedly to kill him. He paused at his cabin door, looking back at the town he'd defended at such cost. Worth it, he decided, despite everything, despite the ghosts and scars and the way violence stained everyone it touched, standing against evil was always worth it. The alternative was a world where bullies won and good people suffered and courage became just another word for stupidity. And Jack Malone, 68 years old, battered but unbroken, refused to live in that world. So he'd stood, he'd fought, he'd paid the price and demanded others pay it alongside him. The mathematics of that decision would be debated by ethicists and lawyers and people who'd never faced equivalent choices. But in the quiet of his cabin, surrounded by memories of Sarah and service and a life spent in duty's embrace, Jack knew he'd made the only choice his soul would tolerate. The last stand wasn't really about winning or losing. It was about refusing to yield, about drawing lines that could not be crossed, about proving that some things remained worth defending, even unto death. He slept that night without dreams, exhaustion finally overcoming the usual nightmares. And when dawn came gray and cold through his window, Jack Malone rose to face another day, another battle, another chance to prove that warriors never truly retired. They just reloaded and waited for the next time duty called their names.